And so now we'll get into the update by staff. Lee Wilcox will be providing an update from the fires, and then Kip will be providing an update from the EOC and also the new statewide risk levels. Jill Bourne will be providing an update on digital inclusion, and then Jim, Reagan, Rick, and Sarah will be giving an update on homeless support and Beautify San Jose. So thanks, I'll pass it off to you, Lee.
Thank you, Dave. So I wanted to update the council on both of the fires to the west and the one to the east of our valley. To the west, known as the CZU fire. That's just shy of 100,000 acres, but it is close to being 50% contained as of this morning. And as we stated last week, evacuations have started to be lifted for this fire, and there's currently no evacuations within the city of Santa Clara for this fire. The larger fire to our east, known as the SCU fire, is currently just shy of 400,000 acres, but is 70% contained. So as of 11 a.m. this morning, CAL FIRE has lifted all warnings and orders within the county of Santa Clara for this fire. Our own fire department continues to be in the field on both fires, as well as the LNU fire north of us in Napa County through mutual aid request. The chief has been able to backfill all companies with relief engines in our own city within our staffing levels. We are continuing through the fire department to partner with CAL FIRE to monitor both fires through the weather forecasting and a fire behavioralist. And the EOC will continue to support those efforts in any ways needed for our own fire department. With that said, our Emergency Operations Center has closed the Evergreen Community Center as a local information center for any residents that were forced to evacuate on any county property. The Sparado High School in Morgan Hill has been closed as a temporary evacuation center, and the Cupertino Community Center has also closed as a temporary shelter facility for both fires. The only one that remains open is the Milpitas Library, and we have word that that'll be closing later on today or tomorrow as the evacuation orders and warnings continue to be lifted. So with that, EOC will continue to monitor this situation and inform the council of any updates as necessary. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kip.
Thank you, Lee. We find ourselves in the pandemic now at a point nationwide where we have 183,649 deaths. Locally here in the county, we have 244 deaths and 138 people in the hospital with COVID-19 struggling through. We know those deaths and hospitalizations have disproportionately been within our Latinx community and on the East Side. Today, I want to talk about the context of the new framework that has come out from the California, the Blueprint for a Safe Economy. What this new framework is a realization that COVID is not going away, so we need a framework until there is a vaccine, and that will ensure a uniform approach statewide that is simple, deliberate, and stringent. It is a 4-tiered framework with 2 different metrics and a 21-day wait period in between movement between the different tiers. So to advance from one tier to the next, a county needs to meet those metrics for 2 continuous weeks. What that changes for us right now is a few things. We are in tier 1 still, widespread, but that does allow some openings that were not allowed under the previous state restrictions. Specifically, hair salons and barbershops can open for indoor use in compliance with the county's regulations and orders. And malls and retail shops can open to 25% capacity, not including food courts. Nail salons and estheticians remain closed indoors, but can work outside as per the county guidance. So again, we are currently in the widespread, the purple here, and we would hopefully be moving down through the stages as our situation improves with the pandemic. This correlates to our own color-coded stages, where we will move through those risk levels, and we will probably adjust our own color coding to match up with the state now that they have a framework that is consistent and in line with what we've been talking about. But we're currently, as I said, in Tier 1 widespread, which corresponds to our Stage 6 and the old state watch list for the most part. So our hope is as soon as we move to the next tier, Tier 2, we will be shifting to what we call Stage 7, which will allow a broader reopening and a resumption of services. As a reminder, in our framework, we are in Stages 6, 7, and 8 until a vaccine is approved and that we begin to scale. So given current conditions, we hope to be in Stage 7 or 8, 7 soon and then 8 after that, but we will likely stay in those stages for the next 6 months or longer. Put another way, we'll be in this at least as long as we have already been in it. So you'll hear a lot from us on a couple of major items later, but I wanted to give you a brief update on our work as the Emergency Operations Center and indeed as a city responding to the emergency. We continue to coordinate with our partners across the county to provide food for at-risk populations, delivering more than 2 million meals across the county with no major gaps reported. You'll be hearing more about that during item 3.3 of today's meeting. We've made significant progress on digital inclusion and distribution of hotspots to school children and their families, which you will hear later about from Jill Bourne and the team. And the EOC Logistics Unit continues to provided power redundancy and air scrubbers to keep shelter sites operational through the power loss events and through the air quality related to the fires. We've released a bid for Beautify SJ work, which you'll hear about again later on in the presentation. And our EPIO continues to amplify messages relating to the fire, wildfire recovery, donations, and alert SCC. We've held extensive community leaders forum and survey to direct additional resident assistance funding. And we've deployed members of our team to support the census work, including PPE for the census workers. We have a trifold brochure that's coming out in 4 languages that contains much of the information that's on our virtual local assistance center, and are printing those brochures to distribute to those who do not have as easy digital access. Phase 1 will go to the family giving tree, senior nutrition, libraries, and various partners. It's about 23,000 brochures, and about 29,000 will go out via the census outreach campaign. We continue to keep the city workforce safe through protective personal equipment, as well as guidance on the wildfire smoke. You'll receive a report later in this meeting as a separate item on the staff's review of the Health and Racial Equity Task Force recommendations. That report details a number of ongoing and newly initiated efforts related to health and racial equity. So with that, let's dive into one of the 2 major topics for today's update, our digital inclusion. And I'll hand it over to Jill Bourne, who in addition to being our city librarian, in this instance is also our branch director for digital inclusion. Jill, take it away. Jill, we're having a little trouble hearing you, or at least I am. You don't appear to be muted, but we're having trouble hearing you. Nope. Hang on just 1 second while we sort this out.
The device appears to be unmuted, but you may have an old version of Zoom.
Uh-oh. So might try the old trick of logging off and logging on again, and we can see if that works. Apologize for the delay.
Do you maybe want to try to skip ahead and come back to Jill?
We can. Jim, would you be ready to go with your team?
We're ready to go.
All right, let me get to the right slide, but why don't you go ahead and start, Jim, and I'll come back to Jill momentarily.
Okay, so good morning, Mayor, members of the council. Jim Ortball, Deputy City Manager and EOC Operations Section Coordinator. The presentation is a follow-up to our June 30th report to the council on our EOC response to the declared shelter crisis during the COVID emergency. Just go ahead and go to the next slide, if you would, Kip. And our efforts to address encampment trash, debris, and blight, as these challenges are much more visible during the many months of COVID. Just as a quick refresh, the EOC has stood up 3 specific branches to address these important issues. The Homeless Support Branch, led by Reagan, the Emergency Housing Branch, led by James Stagey and Matt Kano, and the Beautify SJ Response Branch, which is addressing encampment trash and debris. And they're ultimately working to turn an initiative and an emergency response into a sustainable program that creates clean conditions across our city through an equitable, efficient, and effective program. So Reagan will join me in a bit to present slides about homeless support. Sarah from the city manager's office will present slides about scoping the encampment trash program, and then Rick will talk about our specific efforts in the field. So moving on, the city, in close coordination with the County Office of Supportive Housing, has prioritized slowing and containing the spread of COVID within the unsheltered and encampment communities. Based upon CDC guidance and supported by County Public Health, the city suspended encampment abatements during the COVID emergency to allow the unsheltered to stay where they are and avoid forced dispersal and more close contact among unsheltered people. The city and county have also prioritized various hygiene and sanitation services and have prioritized sheltering the most vulnerable. In terms of impacts, based upon county medical testing records in encampments, the number of positive COVID tests appear to be under control, and there have been no apparent COVID outbreaks in encampments. Although the stationary nature of encampments has exacerbated the amount of visible trash and debris and has challenged the city's resources to keep up, we have a more robust response underway, and we're moving towards a broader systematic effort to address current conditions. Next slide, please. Last week, city, county, and destination home staff presented the community plan to end homelessness that the council unanimously endorsed to continue responding to the urgent crisis of housing over 5,000 unsheltered people across our city. It will take a collective and sustained response to achieve success. Necessarily, though, the city's not waiting and is already in implementation mode. Today, we're going to emphasize strategy 3, improving the quality of life for unsheltered individuals and creating healthy neighborhoods for all. In fact, the 3 EOC branches, emergency housing, homeless support, and Beautify SJ, are strategy 3 focus. Next slide, please. A key goal of the community plan to end homelessness is to double the number of shelter and transitional housing beds. And the emergency housing branch has aggressively moved to increase emergency transitional housing beds for singles, couples, and families by 317 beds at 3 sites. At the Monterey and Burnell site, phase 1 opens this week for the first residents, with all phases targeted to open by mid-September. At Rue Ferrari, living units and common buildings have been delivered to the site with targeted completion by the mid to late September timeframe. And at Evans Lane, living units and common buildings are being delivered with a targeted completion by the end of September. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Reagan. She's going to describe kind of the details of what the Homeless Support Branch has been doing during the COVID crisis.
Jim, good morning, Mayor and Council. Reagan Henninger with the Housing Department. Since March, the Homeless Services Branch of the EOC has been working jointly with the county to shelter and support our most vulnerable homeless individuals. We've been implementing that CDC guidance that Jim mentioned on 4 primary fronts. First, creating new temporary shelter beds to accommodate shelter decompression or thinning of shelters, and also a higher demand for shelter. Creating isolation sites for people with confirmed with COVID. Really building and expanding our emergency interim housing and using hotels as well to safely house older adults and those with the underlying medical conditions. And fourth, providing the street-based services that I'll get into momentarily. Since March, jointly with the county, 2,812 individuals have been placed in hotel motels or in temporary shelters, and that's approximately 934 in hotels and motels and 1,439 in shelters. Our central hotline that we implemented in April has received 6,591 calls. And everyone that has requested shelter so far, we have been able to accommodate those requests. And we continue to coordinate and support our homeless service providers throughout the county by coordinating on shelter bed availability. We also help them meet their supply requests. For example, we help them meet requests for PPE and other supply needs. And we also have been working with public health to coordinate some technical assistance to shelter providers so that they're safely operating their shelters. We also, jointly with the county, implemented a countywide housing problem solving, and that's really that one-time financial assistance along with case management that is a diversion tactic instead of placing people in shelters. We've expanded our motel voucher program for families and also provided additional funding to our partner DV agencies also for motel vouchers. And then finally, we did recently transition to shelters, specifically Parkside Hall, which was slated for development, and Bascom Community Center, which was a commitment to the community. We transitioned 75 individuals from those two locations. We transitioned people to South Hall, some went to the Plaza, some went to Mayberry BHC, and some went to other shelters in the county. But I think what's important to note here is that no one was returned to the streets. Next slide, please. And then also following that CDC guidance that Jim mentioned, we have really scaled our efforts to support encampments. We started back in March by quickly deploying hand washing stations and portable restrooms to our largest encampments. And then as resources came online, we added things like mobile showers. Working with Dignity on Wheels, we also added a new service called Mobile Hope Health, which is a mobile rest stop, if you will. It's a place where people can charge a phone or use a computer or even access remotely Stanford doctors for medical advice. And as Jim mentioned, VHHP has started testing at encampments, and we have seen a fairly low rate of returns. And then finally, we'll continue to scale these street-based services and resources to encampments. A couple weeks ago, Council did approve using one-time funding ESG Cares to start a new program, our SOAR program, which stands for Services, Outreach, Assistance, and Resources. And that will provide additional trash service at encampments, those dedicated street outreach teams that will be staffed by clinicians and people experienced in harm reduction, and we'll also be adding some reserved shelter beds along with motel vouchers. I'm going to hand it back over to Jim.
So on June 30th, when we presented to the council with the initial scoping effort that would be underway in July and August to better understand the intersection of the encampment and illegal dumping challenges and our initial response and a work plan to begin addressing them. So we've been very busy in July and August. On the next slide, I just want to remind the council that the three goals that we identified for this branch, we had emergency trash pickup to really try and address conditions that are very challenging today. Rick Scott will describe more about that, but we also have that third strategic goal to really assess, redefine, and determine the critical gaps in the Beautify SJ program, and then to propose a long-term system and program structure to achieve consistent success, and clean conditions across our city. So those are the goals that we're working on. Next slide, please. So given the conditions that we all see across our city and the number of community complaints that we receive regularly, staff gets the question, it seems to be a simple question, can you just go pick up the trash? If you're a resident who's been seeing a trash pile for weeks, or you keep seeing the same trash pile get picked up by city crews, and then it keeps coming back, or you're a council member and you have community members that are on you to get the trash picked up, it seems like a very reasonable question. And if the city had just a few locations to pick up, or the volume of trash was reasonable, or if it was mostly in bags or some type of trash receptacle, that might be possible. But that's just not the case. And this next slide begins to explain what I mean. Over 99% of the people in our city get trash service at their curb every week. It's a very efficient system, and the city spends about $180 million a year through garbage fees to provide this service to residents. But for the thousands of unsheltered residents in our city, spread over hundreds of encampments in every district in our city, we have no structured trash removal system and no available fees to cover the costs of doing so. Over time, as the number of encampments and unsheltered people have grown, the city, out of necessity, when the complaints become too frequent and too loud to put off, started assigning staff in different departments to pick up trash through abatements and cleanups on an ad hoc basis. The reality is it's not been anywhere near enough to do an effective job and keep the city clean, regardless of how hard the staff works in the Beautify SJ program. Given most trash from the unsheltered does not go into garbage carts, it's not picked up every week, we see conditions on the right side of this slide all too often. And it's important to recognize that it's significantly more labor intensive to pick up and probably 3 to 4 more times more expensive to collect and haul than the established system we have on the left. So at over 200 known encampment locations across the city, weekly trash service is probably what is needed to have clean conditions. Over the past 8 weeks, since we reported to council on June 30th, we've attempted to collect as much data as possible to scope the problem. We may be undercounting the actual number of visits, but I just want to give you a sense of what we're seeing to this point in time. We have a lot of work to do in this area, but preliminarily, about 10% of sites receive trash pickup service weekly or more often at encampments. About 10% receive service about 2 to 4 times a month. Another 15% get service about 1 to 2 times a month. And about 50% get service about once a month or maybe somewhat less. And the remaining sites get very little service at all, given our current resource availability. Now, with the coronavirus relief funds, we certainly are able to ramp that up, and it's something that we're in the process of doing. So I expect over the fall that we're going to see an improvement in the frequency of visits and the response, and we've already started kind of doing that. But I don't think it's going to get us to a place of acceptable conditions and fully clean conditions within that time frame. Next slide, please. So another important aspect of the city's COVID response is to follow CDC and public health guidance to not abate encampments and force the dispersal of the unsheltered, increasing the chances of spreading COVID. We've adjusted to a trash cleanup model in encampments versus full abatements. It does not always result in fully clean conditions, though. The picture on the right illustrates the goal of an encampment cleanup, but when unsheltered residents claim as property what many housed residents might consider trash, it limits the effectiveness of a cleanup. We're working hard and cooperatively with unsheltered residents to keep their areas tidier and to shed material and debris to create cleaner conditions. It's a work in progress, to be very honest. Next slide, please. So work conditions have been anything but easy for the Beautify SJ response team during the past 6 months, responding to encampments during a pandemic, and more recently with poor air quality from wildfires and getting diverted earlier in the year to do protest and vandalism cleanup work, all contributed to less than ideal conditions to perform demanding work productively. While our city team focuses on city properties, our community sees unacceptable conditions on other agency properties like Caltrans, UP, and others, and understandably wants their city to do something about it. These other agencies have differing priorities, protocols, and insufficient resources, which does complicate the job. Next slide, please. So the Beautify SJ team, unfortunately, is in a reactive mode. We are trying to move to a proactive model, but the volume of locations and the amount of material hasn't enabled us to get there fully yet, but that's where we fully intend to get to. An immediate, comprehensive, and effective system has also been hampered by intake systems that don't adequately track the data as nimbly as is needed. Also, insufficient resources, staff, equipment, and contract capacity really has challenged us to see the full picture and to respond everywhere that we need to. So the reality is the Beautify SJ team is starting from a challenging standpoint. Next slide, please. We absolutely do have a path forward, and that's what the rest of this presentation is about. What is really important to understand is that the team is determined to improve conditions and provide the City Council with a clear plan and proposal that aims to serve the right locations with the right services at the right frequency to achieve clean conditions. That's our guiding framework. To do that, we need a system that informs us how to apply services equitably, efficiently, and effectively. And I'll turn it over to Sarah Zarate in terms of scoping our problem.
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, Mayor, council members, and members of the public. My name is Sarah Zarate, and I've supported planning and data activities for the Beautify San Jose branch. Our data strategy is grounded on principles of delivering trash services equitably, efficiently, and effectively. To do that, we embarked on a comprehensive effort to scope the intersection of trash and unsheltered homelessness. This was a challenging effort. There is no single existing data set to analyze these intersecting issues and inform service delivery. Services have been largely driven by requests and complaints. So to build the service model that we're aiming for, we had to start from scratch, which began with a data inventory. This process revealed several findings that inform our current and future work. While some of the data sets needed for this level of analysis are dynamic and update automatically into a platform, many were static, point-in-time data sets that required an extraordinary amount of manual labor to convert them into a form that would allow us to geographically analyze them. Over the next few slides, I'll walk you through, at a high level, the data sets and methodology we use to define how to target limited resources to the areas that are most impacted by the intersection of homelessness and trash and blight. Next slide. The first few data sets helped inform where trash and blight were located. We used illegal dumping hotspots that are informed by both field expertise and 311 data. We use San Jose 311 illegal dumping requests and also council requests to Beautify San Jose. These data sets came in both dynamic and static form. Next slide. Our heaviest lift in terms of data cleaning and manual work occurred with trying to understand where people were living outdoors. The 3 data sets used that included homeless concerns hotline calls and emails, street outreach, and encampment abatements are all maintained in forms that render them static and don't allow us to automatically update and analyze them in conjunction with other data sets. Moreover, all 3 required a lot of manual work to convert encampment location descriptions, as seen in column B, into geolocated points on a map that could be viewed relative to other data points and allow for spatial analysis. Next slide. A little more dynamic in terms of where people live were the 2 data sets that were developed post-COVID. On the left are the 16 SOAR locations identified by the Housing Department as the largest encampments in the city. On the right is a new data set. When we learned Olympia's team began doing encampment trash pickups, we worked with Public Works staff to create a new tracking method for the team. This data set provides a rich source of data points reflecting where people are living based on both field staff expertise as well as requests and complaints coming from various sources. Next slide. On June 30th, we left off by saying that trash and unsheltered homelessness were distinct but widespread issues in the city. Our branch has and continues to work to understand and refine the intersectionality of these issues. By applying a thoughtful methodology to an overlay analysis of the various data sets I just showed you that included a minimum threshold of at least one homeless-related data point and one trash or blight data point within defined spaces, we were able to create the first visual representation of encampment and trash hotspots in San Jose. The map on the right, called a hex bin map, helps narrow our scope by counting the intersecting data points and representing them through a color gradient. Next slide. The combined hotspot map was a big milestone, but as I mentioned earlier, we were working with static and dynamic data sets, meaning that we needed to do some ground truthing. Ground truthing was also essential from the perspective of moving away from a primarily complaint-based response system to one that distributes resources more equitably by analyzing the magnitude of needs relative to each other. Next slide. To accomplish this, we worked with a GIS expert in DOT to convert our hotspot map into a visual site assessment routes that would allow us to document existing conditions that required services across the city. These routes were created methodically, requiring that a hotspot location hit a certain threshold to receive a visual assessment. Routes were divided into 4 quadrants, and DOT staff traveled the routes, documenting existing conditions through web-based surveys out in the field. Our first round of visual assessments resulted in over 300 survey submissions reflecting current conditions of unsheltered homelessness in our city in hotspot locations. Site assessments were conducted on or near streets and trails. Some creek adjacency was assessed, but none were conducted inside of creeks to ensure staff safety. Each survey submitted had a variety of data points, including pictures that help support our understanding of the magnitude of issues on the ground, access points for trash pickup, and the general state of cleanliness around encampments. Next slide. In all, this phase covered 195 miles of city streets, resulting in the identification of 483 structures and 222 campers from accessible street view. Importantly, the number of unsheltered residents represented by the observations is greater than the tent and vehicle counts, as, for example, you may have several people living in one structure or vehicle. Next slide. Although this provided the first comprehensive on-the-ground view of unsheltered homelessness with geolocating, this was still raw data, requiring us to organize field observations into buckets of services needed, which Rick will go into in more detail. This was a manual process where we had to look at pictures corresponding to each survey in order to assess them relative to each other and categorize them by severity. The lower end of the spectrum indicated a fairly clean site needing basic trash pickup, with the higher end requiring extensive relationship building with the encampment resident, as well as heavy equipment to remove trash and large debris. Next slide. So much has been learned and achieved over the last several weeks, going from blobs of data on a map to trash pickup routes for service providers. And it was done with the intention of serving some of our most vulnerable residents where they are. The city has rich data sets, though they're not always in the format needed to answer a specific question. And data without thoughtful analysis doesn't alone answer questions of priority, equity, and efficiency. Although I've had the privilege of presenting this data portfolio to you, it's really thanks to the technical expertise of staff in Public Works, DOT, and the City Manager's Office, with field staff knowledge from housing, PRNS, DOT, and ESD, that we were able to conduct this level of sophisticated data analysis in a small amount of time. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rick Scott to describe our service model.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Rick Scott, and I'm currently serving as the EOC Beautify SJ Response Branch Director. The combination of employee expertise, data analysis, and field verifications helped us differentiate 3 broad tiers of service in our preliminary service model framework that you see on this slide. On the bottom, you see Tier 1. Tier 1 are areas where encampments exist, but the quantity of debris and complexity of the sites make them good candidates for ongoing light touch trash services. They are also more easily accessible. This level of service could include the regular drop-off and pickup of trash bags with some adjacent litter pickup. This work has been assigned to our nonprofit partners, Downtown Streets Team and Goodwill Industries, and we're in the process of evaluating the effectiveness of this service. Above that, the middle level represents Tier 2 areas. Tier 2 sites include many of the city's trails, which are more difficult to access and require more extensive labor and equipment to service. Accordingly, the Conservation Corps has been brought in to provide the services here, and we are in the process of evaluating their efforts as well. The top level, Tier 3 sites, are our most complicated and unfortunately plentiful at this time. We've determined that these sites will require more extensive resident engagement, as Sarah mentioned, and staff work, contractor expertise, and heavy equipment than the previous 2 tiers. Whereas we have assigned providers to service lines in the other 2 tiers, we are in the process of aligning our resources with needs for these Tier 3 sites. There's still significant work required to fully operationalize this tier, but the Beautify SJ field team is currently applying its expertise and resources to provide services to these sites. Although, as Jim has mentioned, it's not as substantial or frequent as we believe will be required in the long run to lead to clean results. Now, if you look at the icon on the left, that captures the dynamic nature of our service line because the people continually generate trash and they may move. So accordingly, this service model will require consistent feedback and ways to meet new, emerging, and modified service demands. As an example, a Tier 1 site, if ignored, could become a Tier 3 site. But if services are properly allocated, it's possible to change a Tier 3 site to a Tier 1 site. The branch also acknowledges that despite our efforts to systematize and make trash pickup for encampment residents a routine service, there will always be service requests for which program management personnel will have responsibility to assess the request, determine the appropriate response, and align program resources to address within program capacity. Next slide, please. So here's our tiers in action. To the left, you see Tier 1. Which we previously mentioned, there are 28 routes that have already been assigned to Downtown Streets Team and Goodwill. Our goal is to ensure service every 1 to 2 weeks, but we are early in the process of evaluating performance and capabilities. These routes range in length from about a quarter mile to a mile each and can look like this on the left with trash bags easy to pick up and trying to foster compliance with the residents that are there. Tier 2 on the right, there are 20 routes primarily on our trails that receive service from Conservation Corps. Preliminary target is 1 service for every 2 weeks, but we're currently in the evaluative process here as well. The routes range in length from about a quarter mile to a mile and a quarter in length. And this is a photo of what they look like out there. Both Tier 1 and Tier 2, we have brought these contractors online. They're providing the services and we're in the process of assessing success. Next slide. So Tier 3, as shown, are far more complicated. Whereas, as I've mentioned, we have 48 sites in the 48 areas in Tiers 1 and 2 combined. Tier 3 contains over 150 areas with some combination of large and entrenched encampments, large amounts of personal property mixed with trash, and where substantial outreach and engagement will be required to facilitate effective cleanups. Some of these sites will also require heavy or specialized equipment. As we've discussed, the Beautify SJ team is providing a level of maintenance to these sites, but it is not consistent or substantial enough to satisfactorily address the concerns due to the sheer scope and size and number of these sites. We're in the process of assessing the sites and determining the appropriate response to align with additional resources that we're bringing online, which I'll discuss in future slides. Next slide, please. So as we can see, our largest current gap is occurring at our tier 3 sites because they're our most complicated ones. We're making progress in our service model 1.0 and taking action to add staffing and capacity. So as I've mentioned, 48 routes have been assigned to providers which are employing currently and formerly homeless residents. These services are being funded through December 2020 with 3 grants totaling $450,000 in coronavirus relief funds. For tier 3 in particular, immediately after our conversation in June, we brought on 2 short-term contracts to extend existing encampment cleanup services from June through September. We have just released last week an RFP with the goal of awarding $1.5 million in contracts by the end of September to provide more extensive encampment cleanups and services through December. It will be a substantial increase in our capacity once that's brought online. Slide, please. So much of our branch's efforts have been focused on measuring and quantifying our citywide challenges and providing services within our existing resources. And as you've seen, it's a very substantial effort that this branch has undertaken. At our last presentation, we did commit to piloting dumpster deployments at 5 locations. And fortunately, we quickly saw success with cooperation, cleanliness, and cost effectiveness, as well as positive feedback from many of our encampment residents. So we've expedited the deployment from 5 to 11 sites, 10 of which are the SOAR locations, as we previously mentioned. That brings the total of citywide dumpsters deployed to 26 cubic yard dumpsters, which is essentially more than doubled what we had mentioned we were piloting in June. We're currently implementing our evaluation framework to determine the cost effectiveness, sustainability, and scaling opportunities here, and have 2 further sites that we're currently considering for a deployment in the near future. This slide that you're now seeing indicates a key point that in this line of work, success can be pretty complicated. Felipe is one of our SOAR sites, and it's one of our most challenging sites, as you see from the photo on the left. This was only a very small part of the trash and debris that was there prior to the commencement of dumpster services in this area. As we deployed dumpsters to the sites, we had some concerns given these challenges. And as you can see, even with dumpsters deployed, there is some loose trash and debris. Continuous engagement with the residents will be required to increase cooperation and ensure that the dumpsters aren't damaged. We've also seen some illegal dumping at these locations, which continues to be a challenge, but it also means that debris is more isolated and easier for contractors to pick up. In the short term, we have city staff checking dumpster locations frequently to ensure that they are not impeded prior to contractor service. The conditions are improved and ongoing service is possible and being provided 3 days per week at this and many other of our sites. And I just want to reemphasize again, the photo on the left was just a small part of the trash and challenges that were there prior to the deployment of the dumpsters. So the photo on the right represents a substantial improvement. And again, we've received very positive feedback from the residents of this encampment and are considering another dumpster deployment to this area to handle the magnitude of the trash. Slide, please. We're also experimenting with a number of other lines of service in we're calling service model 1.0 of strategic goal 1. So by mid-September, we'll have mobile trash services online with our contractor called Green Team. We'll have 2 cruises listed, one to perform regular scheduled trash pickup at designated locations, and one to address hotspots or heavy items as required and as work lists are generated and provided to the contractor. As I've mentioned, we also released an RFP that will result in $1.5 million more in contractual capacity to address these larger and more complicated cleanups, particularly in our Tier 3 inventory. We are also reinitiating the Cash for Trash program, which has had success and good participation in the past. And importantly, we are working across EOC branches to develop more substantial and robust homeless community engagement capacity and protocols in the hopes of gaining support and cooperation for cleaner encampments in a cleaner city. With that, I'll pass it back to Jim Ortball.
So thanks, Rick. So last 2 slides here. So our presentation today indicates that although we have put in motion significant initial assessment and cleaning activities, we have a long way to go to develop a service model that will consistently achieve the results that we all want, a clean city. We still have these intersecting issues of homelessness during a pandemic and high rates of illegal dumping that makes it hard to define, predict, and solve for all the variables. The data systems are decentralized, and the intake systems create tracking inefficiencies and result in a misalignment between where the needs are greatest and where the loudest complaints are coming from, which creates inequities and pulls at good resource allocation. Protocols on abatements versus cleanups, homeless shelter outreach versus trash cleanup at encampments, and what the city is doing versus what many other public agencies are doing remains somewhat fractured, although we'll be working on that more so. Extensive engagement with the unsheltered is required to address complex sites. It's not easy, it's labor intensive, and it must be done skillfully and patiently to be effective. Currently, the bulk of our work is supported by coronavirus relief funds through December 2020. So we must address in the annual report the January to June 2021 gap, and we must develop an ongoing base level of funding to support needed work. Finally, we have staffing, equipment, and contractors deployed 7 days a week, so our capacity is challenged, so we need to develop new streams of capacity. And my last slide. With the many challenges I've just described, as well as Reagan, Sarah, and Rick, we have much work ahead in the fall and beyond. We need to invest in data intake and integration across departments. Finding the capacity to get this done will be difficult, but it has to occur if we're going to solve this problem. The core question to figure out is serving the right locations with the right services at the right frequency. That ultimately is what will achieve the results we all want from a cleanliness standpoint. We have further work to do to align protocols across departments within the city first and then with our partner agencies on the outside. That's going to take some time. By the study session in December, we need to define long-term success, clearly identify the needs with as much specificity as possible, and accordingly identify the service and resource gaps and provide the council with a clear proposal on what investment will be required to achieve the various service levels and results, and allow the city council to weigh and determine its priority for this service area. So that concludes our presentation. I want to thank the many city employees across many EOC branches that have worked extremely hard addressing these multiple crises, and they're doing great work during trying times. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you, Jim. This would be a good time to take a break, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Vice Mayor, if that would be what you would like to do right now. And we can come back to digital inclusion after lunch, if that works.
That would be good, Kip. Let's take a break and we will resume at 1:30.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. Let's resume our meeting now. Tony, perhaps you could run the roll, and then we will go to Jill Bourne, who I think is going to lead us in the digital inclusion update on item 3.1.
Jimenez.
Tony?
Present.
Perales. Diep.
Present.
Carrasco.
Here.
Davis.
Here.
Esparza.
Here.
Arenas.
Here.
Foley.
Here.
Yemis.
Here.
Jones.
Present.
Liccardo.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. All right, back to Dave, which I think means back to Jill. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now.
We
Yes,
can.
we can. Thanks, Jill. And for
Yay.
anybody watching at home, we're on item 3.1, which is the city manager's report. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you, Mayor. Today we're going to provide an overview of the digital inclusion efforts since our last major city council action on June 23rd. So these efforts are always a high priority, but have been made even more urgent during the COVID pandemic for many reasons, including the fact that the lack of digital connectivity and capacity isolates our residents from accessing critical services, inhibits communication and engagement, disrupts educational opportunities and progress, and exacerbates existing social and economic inequities. Next slide. On June 23rd, City Council approved the Digital Inclusion Expenditure Plan, which allocated 3 different sources of funding to several projects, which we will review progress on today. The total value of the city's commitment at that time was $8.2 million. Next slide. Prior to the expenditure plan on May 19th, City Council approved the Emergency Digital Inclusion Fund process, which allowed us to quickly receive and disperse any donations made to the fund in response to the COVID crisis. So far, the total dispersed donor designated funds of about $524,000 have gone to the Alum Rock, Franklin McKinley, and Rocketship schools for purchase of devices. Mayor Liccardo and his team in the Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation have been deeply involved in fundraising, so we want to thank them for that work. In addition, the original expenditure plan, I'll go back, included $1,000 for devices, which either refurbished or new. In discussions with the County Office of Education, this amount was recommended for disbursement to the Mount Pleasant Elementary School District. And then lastly, the city budget included a coronavirus relief fund allocation for the Oak Grove School District per a request from Councilmember Jimenez, also for devices. So as of last week, all of these funds have been dispersed to the schools. Next slide. The Digital Inclusion Expenditure Plan included a strong commitment to connectivity for our residents, especially students. In early August, through a partnership with AT&T, nearly 8,300 hotspots were distributed to 16 school districts and the County Office of Education. At that time, this number met all requests. However, due to the first couple of weeks of school, many districts realized that their students and families' needs were greater than earlier reported. In some cases, they learned that other solutions that they had been piloting were less effective. So as a result, a new round of requests for hotspots was received, totaling nearly 4,800 hotspots across 25 districts and charter networks that serve students in San Jose. Next slide. The good news is that we received very positive feedback about the SJ Access hotspot device itself. The local education agencies, or LEAs, who are our partners, report that these hotspots are higher performing, serves the entire home with multiple users, and only about 0.2% of devices have required any high-level technical assistance, and most issues have been able to be resolved over the phone or through a simple reboot. Next slide. And now that the first phase of school distribution is completed, our plan was to move forward with circulating hotspots to other unconnected non-student households. First, we've reserved up to 1,000 of those hotspots to provide additional student households until we're able to figure out how to respond to the new outstanding need. Secondly, to ensure that we're reaching households in need and those that are most difficult to reach, the plan is to partner with local community-based organizations serving vulnerable populations to circulate hotspots on long-term loan, plus providing wraparound support to achieve full digital adoption. Next slide. Another key element of the city's digital inclusion plan was to support the convening of education stakeholders in partner with the Santa Clara County Office of Education to ensure alignment and collective impact. We are now planning a third in the series of connectivity, digital inclusion, and access events hosted by Superintendent Dr. Dewan, which has been attended by hundreds of interested partners so far. Staff also hosted a special convening for members of the Digital Equity Coalition to ensure that the SJ Access program is rolled out effectively to our education community. Next slide. And then simultaneous to the hotspot distribution process, staff have worked closely with the County Office of Education and school districts to convene host convenings related to the SJ Access program. This continues with ongoing support to provide technical assistance, maintain the website with useful information, and manage any issues, as well as providing reports of usage on request. Next slide. The digital inclusion plan featured two major infrastructure efforts as well. First, to provide outdoor Wi-Fi to facilitate social distancing, promote public health, and provide high quality internet outside of open hours and to support distance learning. In some cases, we are also enhancing indoor Wi-Fi when it enhances the outdoor Wi-Fi as well. The approved funding for this project was $457,000, which essentially covers the equipment and the consultant fees. But upon further analysis, additional costs were identified for public works staff to manage what's essentially construction projects and provide standard contingencies, as well as the cost of increased bandwidth for community center sites over the next 3 months. Excuse me. Actually make that 5 months. 4 months, sorry. These added charges are covered by the funds that were already allocated by City Council for digital inclusion. The projects are currently completing design phase and plan to advertise for construction bids next week to start construction by October. Next slide. Finally, the city worked closely with the Eastside Union High School District to ensure full funding for the Access Eastside community Wi-Fi build out. This was the approved funding plan. Next slide. And the current status is shown here. Oberfeld is now open to the public. Yerba Buena is starting construction this month. The next 3 attendance areas, Independence, Entropy Hill, and Oak Grove, were all subject to 2 RFP processes, one for federal funding and one for non-federal funding, with the goal of having multiple consultants available to do the design work. The RFP closes tomorrow, Wednesday, September 2nd. And then next slide. As we push forward to meet the digital access needs of our communities, our next steps include quickly pursuing funding options for acquiring more hotspots for our school partners, continuing our direct technical support to families and schools, continuing to distribute any emergency donations from the Digital Inclusion Fund, initiating construction of Wi-Fi enhancements at city facilities, completing the Yerba Buena attendance area build out, and selecting a vendor for the next 3 attendance areas in Access Eastside, and the finalization of the MOU between Eastside Union High School District and the Eastside Alliance schools that impacts the overall funding for several attendance areas. That concludes the update. I am here for questions as well as members of the Digital Inclusion Branch and our partners in Public Works.
We just have a couple of slides at the very end here that I'll conclude with quickly, and then we will open to any questions from the council and of course public comment for the entire presentation. And I apologize for scrolling through all of these. I just, oops, there we go. So we have no meeting next week, and on September 15th, we will have no 3.1 update given the number of items on council and to allow council enough space and time to consider those items. We'll come back on September 22nd with updates on concurrent emergency planning for other events such as the power shutoffs, fires, and future work. We will also be coming back with a deep dive on public health order outreach, education, compliance, and communication overall. On the regular agenda at this point, tentatively, is a fiscal recovery update and coronavirus relief fund rebalancing, where we'll be bringing back the status of the funds and an opportunity to rebalance funding to priorities. So I'd like to close, Dave opened with our unsung heroes internally. I'd like to close with highlighting one of our amazing partners. All of this work is done in partnership with the community, with nonprofits, with community-based organizations. And today I want to highlight the work of Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County, which has been a long time partner of the city in deep and meaningful ways. The mission of Catholic Charities is to disrupt the cycle of poverty and serve those in need to reduce the effects and conditions of poverty. They have been one of our strongest partners, excuse me, with over 225 employees committed to the emergency response, 175,000 families fed as a result of their efforts, about 5.5 million meals, 9 parish drive-through locations. Father John has been very instrumental in that, among others. 10 family resource centers providing food, formula, and diapers, those critical necessities for those with young children. 500 children in 10 schools, Franklin McKinley, supported remotely through Coral Digital Literacy and San Jose Learns, and about $4 million in direct rental assistance, which they have distributed. Additionally, they've been providing a virtual senior wellness support and convening the Bridge to Recovery efforts to look at workforce and job training opportunities. So I want to thank both the CEO, Greg Kempferly, and the entire Catholic Charities team for being a great partner and doing such great work in the community with us during our time of crisis. With that, we conclude our 3.1 presentation and are open to any questions, comment, or feedback you may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.